The air in this specific unnamed corner of the Pacific Northwest always carried the same dense, unshakable perfume. 3 parts ancient cedar, 2 parts fresh rain, and 1 part deep, wet decay. It was the scent of a place the mapmakers had decided was settled, but which the trees knew belonged still to the moss and the constant, indifferent fog. Ray Harris, 38 and looking 50 under the relentless gray sky, pulled his old, wool-lined collar tight against the damp chill. It was early November, and the temperature stood at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The mist clung to the ground like old gauze. He was here because of a phone call from an old ranger named Sal. Sal had not spoken about poachers or typical forest trouble. He had simply used the word wrong. And Sal, who had seen black bears with tumors and cougars with rabies, rarely used that word. The smell hit Harris 50 yards before the sight itself, not the usual coppery tang of venison hanging in a butcher shop, but something heavier, metallic and profound, thick enough to taste on the back of his throat. It mixed sickeningly with the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles underfoot. When he reached the small clearing, the sheer geometry of the scene struck him first, defying all logic of the wild. 4 massive bull moose, animals that could weigh over 1,000 pounds, lay in an almost perfect circle. Their bodies had not been scavenged or haphazardly torn apart. They were eliminated with chilling, almost ritualistic precision. Harris knelt by the nearest animal, its huge head resting on the damp earth. The gash was the size of a man's fist, running clean across the throat. The jugulars were severed, not chewed. The movement that ended the animal's life was instantaneous, a single horrifying surge of kinetic force. No torn-up dirt marked a struggle. Only the short, brutal finality of life abruptly cut short. Harris straightened up, the familiar cold knot tightening in his stomach. He was a man who had walked away from the job 5 years ago because the job insisted that the world was orderly, and he knew, deep in his bones, that it was not. He turned his attention to the ground, soft and yielding from days of steady rain. This was the real clue. Around the perimeter of the circle, where the soil was soaked dark with animal blood, were the tracks. The initial impression was heavy, wide, and flat, but this shape was misleading. Harris leaned closer, tracing the outlines with a gloved finger. Bears left paw prints, often overlapping, often sloppy, dragging claws. These were different. They showed 5 distinct digits, ending in deep, sharp grooves, claws easily an inch long. And the pattern of the prints was not the chaotic, shuffling drag of a quadruped, struggling with heavy prey. These prints were arranged in pairs, stepping deliberately, one slightly ahead of the other, confirming a heavy creature moving on 2 legs. Bipedal. The heel strike was pronounced, carrying tremendous weight. The stride was long, nearly 4 feet. This was a predator, yes, but one that knew how to walk upright. A sputtering Ford pickup finally broke the oppressive silence, tires crunching on the wet gravel road far too loudly. It was Sheriff Tate, a man whose face seemed perpetually set in the mold of a cheap, disappointed detective from a 1970s television show. "Well, hell, Ray," Tate sighed, hands jammed into his thick, oil-stained jacket pockets. "We got some serious poaching here." Tate's voice, flat and grating, instantly filled Harris with the profound, exhausting disappointment he thought he had escaped when he moved out to this isolated cabin. "It's not poachers, Sheriff," Harris said, his voice flat. He could feel the familiar bitter taste of memory rising, the burn of old good whiskey he used to keep in his desk drawer, the only thing that had helped him tolerate the institutional myopia of the police department back in the city. Poachers leave shell casings. They leave tire tracks that don't belong to Forest Service vehicles. They leave guts. And usually, they only take the antlers and the best cuts. They do not perform this kind of surgical cleanup. Tate scoffed, gesturing vaguely at the massacre with a dismissive hand. Lot of blood, though. Must have been a big knife. Some crazy son of a bitch with a vendetta against the Department of Wildlife. Look at the wound, Sheriff. Harris pushed the enormous matted head of the moose slightly aside. A knife, even a large one, requires effort and multiple cuts to slice through that muscle and hide. This was done in one movement. And look at the surrounding tissue. Harris took a moment, pushing his fingers into the torn orifice. The depth was alarming, exceeding the reach of any wolf or mountain lion jaw. It suggested length and puncture. But the edges of the wound, while torn, looked almost cauterized, surrounded by a strange, dark ring of tissue that did not look like simple bruising. The wound suggested chemical disruption and an incredibly high kinetic temperature upon impact. It was the work of pure, focused brutality, applied with an unnatural precision that bordered on expertise. The only sound now was the wind, a thin, cold whistle high in the pines, and the distant, slow drip of water off a hemlock branch. This forest, even in the late fall gloom, was usually alive with birdsong, the frantic skittering of squirrels preparing for winter, and the soft, ceaseless hum of insects. But here, the air was dead. The silence was absolute, a heavy velvet blanket pressing down on the clearing. The forest was holding its breath, listening to the two men argue over how a slaughter should be defined. Harris moved away from the main cluster of bodies, following the faint, lingering metallic smell. A half-mile into the deeper woods, near a massive, moss-covered boulder, the smell of fresh blood dissipated, replaced by something far more complex and troubling. He found a patch of ground, maybe 10 feet across, that was distinctly different from the surrounding damp loam. The soil here was dry, almost dusty, and permeated with the vestige of a fire. There were no visible fire rings, no charred logs, nothing to suggest a typical campfire. The scent was a specific, acrid blend. Ash mixed with the sickly, sharp tang of sulfur and something else. A potent, wet, musky odor, deeply animalistic, like the bedding of a very large, stressed beast. It was as if something enormous had settled here for a protracted period, radiating enough heat to dry the surrounding soil, waiting, calculating. Harris stood over the patch, the cold dread crawling up his spine. The rational mind demanded a biological explanation, but the facts contradicted that assumption. The cold prickle on the back of his neck, the one that never lied, whispered a different truth. This was not the chaotic hunger of a natural predator. This was intelligence cloaked in muscle and rage. The tracks were too deliberate, the kills too clean, the subsequent silence too profound. It was the same feeling he had 5 years ago when they showed him the photos of the ravaged bodies near the river. The creeping certainty that whatever was walking through these woods was not catalogued in any field guide. It was here, and it was watching, and it was beyond the feeble reach of human understanding. The memory of that old, terrifying case was now no longer a memory, but a fresh, immediate threat. The rain started again just as Harris made it back to his dilapidated A-frame cabin, settling in for the kind of cold, steady downpour that turns the world into a gray watercolor painting and lasts for days. He wiped the mud from his boots on the splintered porch, the damp chill already sinking into his bones. The cabin was a refuge of last resort, smelling perpetually of pine resin and old coffee grounds, a place where he came to stop talking and start observing. He could not shake the image of the tracks, the perfect heavy print of 5 digits, the length of the stride, the almost casual disposal of 4 tons of muscle. Sheriff Tate's bluster about poachers was predictable, the reflex of a small-town mind desperate to keep the terrifying uncertainty of the wild at bay. Harris went down to the basement, a low-ceilinged space smelling strongly of mildew and the slow rot of cedar beams. He had not ventured down here much in the 5 years since he had become an exile, preferring to leave the past sealed away. Tonight, he needed to resurrect it. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating stacks of cardboard boxes labeled with his old life. He finally found the box marked, "Closed 2019. Inside, wrapped in brittle plastic sheeting, was the file. Case 2019. A. Disappearance of 3 high schoolers near the Whitcomb River. The police brass had closed it fast. Tragic canoeing accident. Bodies swept out to the Pacific. But Harris remembered the sickening, protracted battle he had fought to argue that the fragments of remains they had found, a hand here, a part of a pelvis there, were not victims of the river's currents. They were victims of something that hunted them. He opened the manila folder. The paper felt clammy and fragile in his hands. He looked at the grainy black and white photos of the riverbank, photos that had led to his forced leave of absence, his subsequent resignation, and the quiet, persistent rumor that Ray Harris had gone completely unhinged. The notes were still there, written in his precise, cramped script, predator prints inconsistent with known local species. Bipedal movement confirmed. Claws present, length estimated at 1 inch. Injuries consistent with extreme, instantaneous tensile force. He compared the photos of the mangled remains from 2019 to the digital images he had just taken of the moose kills. A cold certainty settled over him, heavier than the damp air. The pattern matched. In both instances, the primary attack focused on the throat. In the teen's case, internal organs had been violently extracted and then discarded nearby, uneaten. In the moose, the kill was clean, but the absence of feeding suggested the same lack of typical predatory hunger. It was elimination, not sustenance. The technique was identical, applied with efficient, cold brutality. It had been 5 years. 5 years of solitude, chopping wood, tending the meager garden, learning to move through the forest with the quiet grace of something that belonged there. 5 years living with the knowledge that he had seen a wolf that stood like a man, a truth the world was designed to reject. He had not been crazy. He had just been 5 years early. That night, the first after confirming his worst fears, Harris did not sleep. He sat in his worn armchair, the heavy shotgun resting across his knees, the smooth, cold wood of the stock comforting in its solidity. Just after midnight, the cold, wet silence of the forest was violently fractured. It was not a howl. A wolf howl is resonant, musical, a long, high lament meant for communication across miles. This was different. It was a low, thick sound, tearing through the heavy mist that had rolled in from the river, deep in the chest. utterly guttural. The sound had a horrible choking quality to it, a ragged roar that dissolved quickly into a sort of desperate, broken human cry, choked off by pure, savage anger. It was the sound of intelligence trying and failing to communicate through a throat built for tearing flesh. The sound resonated not just in the air, but physically in the cavity of his chest. Harris walked slowly to the small, grimy window pane and peered out into the impenetrable blackness. The air was thick, suffocating. He did not feel the sudden jolt of terror. He felt something colder, more existential. The horror was not the size or the strength of the predator. It was the realization that the creature understood. It was not random savagery. It was methodical. He stood there for 20 minutes, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the rain off the eaves. The darkness seemed to press in on the cabin, not just blocking light, but consuming it. He went to bed, but consciousness remained suspended, waiting. In the morning, the weak sunlight fought a losing battle against the perpetual gray. Harris, running on adrenaline and stale coffee, started to check the perimeter of the cabin instinctively. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the back door, which he habitually locked with a heavy slide bolt, was standing slightly ajar, maybe 3 inches. He froze, feeling the hairs stand up on his arms despite the lack of cold inside. He knew he had locked it. He always locked it. Nothing appeared stolen. His meager supplies were untouched. The old, rusty tools were still hanging on their hooks, but by the threshold, right on the edge of the smooth, worn pine floorboards, was the evidence. A faint smear of mud and water, slowly drying. Harris knelt. The mud was the color of the river clay, dark and fine-grained. The smear resolved into a single, undeniable print. It was massive, nearly 15 inches long. 5 toes, clearly defined, and running through the clay, the deep, unmistakable gouges of long, sharp claws. The print was not accidental. It was placed squarely on the threshold. The creature had not broken in. It had opened the door and stood there momentarily, studying him while he slept. It had not come for sustenance or even immediate violence. It had come for surveillance. It knew where he lived. It knew what he was doing. The past was repeating itself, only this time the stakes were higher, and the awareness was mutual. He went back to the armchair and picked up the shotgun. He disassembled it on the kitchen table, running the oily rags over the blue steel barrel. The weight of the metal felt honest and reassuring. This was no longer a cold case. It was a fresh threat, a private war. And this time, Harris was prepared to meet the enemy on its own horrifying terms. He was ready to re-enter the nightmare he thought he had left behind, because the nightmare, it seemed, had decided to come home. Harris spent the next 3 days in a fog of methodical activity, moving like a specter through the landscape where the moose had met their fate. The weather remained grimly consistent, a cold drizzle that soaked everything, turning the already difficult terrain into slick, treacherous mud. For Harris, the constant damp was an asset. The rain helped scrub away the lingering scent of human interference, leaving the air cleaner, perhaps allowing the predator to relax its vigilance. His task was intricate and necessary, setting up a network of surveillance. He used 4 high-resolution field cameras equipped with infrared night vision and passive infrared PIR heat sensors, capable of detecting movement in temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not aim to track a rabbit or a deer. He was looking for a heat signature the size of a small automobile moving on two legs. He worked patiently, anchoring the cameras high in the boughs of thick spruce trees, camouflaging them with branches and natural fibers, adjusting the sensitivity so that the wind rattling the smaller maples would not trigger a false alarm. The wet earth under his boots squelched with every movement, but he moved with the silence of a man who had forgotten how to make unnecessary noise. Finally, the work was done. He left the remains of the moose undisturbed, a gory, silent altar in the clearing. If the creature returned, it would be drawn back to the scene of its efficiency. The first night's yield was nothing but frustration. Harris sat hunched over his laptop in the early morning darkness, reviewing the footage. The memory card held hundreds of segmented clips, mostly fog blowing across the lens, a startled owl, or the heavy drip of rain. He saw only streaks, too fast, too shadowy, blurred movement across the edges of the frame. Whatever it was, it possessed impossible speed. The digital noise made the dark image look like static from an old analog television set. He was about to discard the evening's work when he reached the last camera, the one positioned deepest in the trees, focused on the large boulder where he had smelled the sulfur and ash. The clip was momentary, lasting less than a second, but it caught a verticality that no bear or cat could achieve. A dense, high mass of shadow, passing through the corner of the frame like a glitch in the world's fabric. The second night was different. At 2:37 a.m., the sensor on the primary camera flared to life. The motion detector tracked something slow and heavy entering the periphery. Harris leaned close to the screen, adjusting the brightness. The creature was massive. 7, perhaps closer to 7.5 feet tall when fully upright, its body covered in thick, dark, coarse fur that seemed to absorb the faint moonlight. Its bulk suggested incredible density and muscle mass, easily weighing 300 pounds. It moved with a deceptive gait, heavy, yes, but its footfalls were placed with unnerving precision. It was not lumbering, it was stalking. The movement was fluid, graceful, almost balletic, despite the apparent weight. This was the gait of something that understood momentum and leverage. The most unnerving segment came when the creature reached the nearest moose carcass. It did not immediately plunge its snout into the kill. Instead, it paused, standing fully upright. It lowered its head, sniffing the clean, devastating wound. Then, it extended a massive 5-fingered paw, the digits ending in those wicked long claws, and gently traced the torn muscle tissue where the throat had been. It was an examination, a critique. The creature was reviewing its own work, or perhaps simply studying the texture of the finished product. It did not appear hungry. It was an assessor, not a scavenger. After a moment of chilling observation, the predator turned its flat, large head away from the carcass with a sharp, decisive motion before melting back into the shadows. The total time on screen was less than 40 seconds. Harris played the segment 5 times, the sound of the creature's wet, rasping breath the only noise in his quiet cabin. It was intelligent. It was tactical. He went out at first light. The image of the creature's deliberate movements seared into his mind. He needed to find where it had paused, where it had watched the final moments of the moose. He found the spot easily, a muddy depression near the large spruce. The 5-toed print was clear, and here, mingling faintly with the pervasive smells of pine and decay, were 2 distinct, unusual odors. The first was a weak, fleeting whiff of sulfur and something akin to scorched hair. The second was baffling. The faint metallic scent of burned gunpowder, mixed strangely with the heavy, savory aroma of wet commercial dog food, like kibble left out in the rain. 50 feet away, behind a dense barricade of fallen timber and heavy brush, he found the projectile. It was stuck deep into the rotting bark of a fir tree, its flight shaft vibrating slightly in the cold air. It was a modern hunting arrow, sleek and black, crafted from high-grade carbon fiber. Light, precise, and expensive. The broadhead tip was enormous, designed for maximum internal damage. Harris worked it free, wiping the wet grit from the carbon shaft. Near the nock, where the arrow meets the bowstring, he spotted a minute, almost microscopic etching. He squinted, holding it up to the weak light. D97. He knew that marking. It was not commercial. D97 was a designation used for a specific lot of specialized carbon fiber archery projectiles, often reserved for military or quasi-military tactical teams, the kind of gear used in low-noise, high-precision training for special forces or Park Service reconnaissance units designed to operate deep behind lines. The creature had been observed, targeted. This changed the narrative entirely. The predator was not just a mutant anomaly roaming the hills. It was involved in a larger, hidden conflict. An arrow like this confirmed a human presence. A hunter, highly trained, operating outside the official jurisdiction. But the question hammered Harris with cold force. If the creature was the prey of these specialized hunters, why were the hunters no longer around? And if the hunters were gone, how had the creature learned to examine a wound, to stalk with such deliberate, almost human focus? Had the hunter become the hunted? Or was this monster simply learning its lessons from those it had already eliminated? The carbon fiber arrow felt heavy in Harris's hand, a physical link to a world of state-sponsored secrecy and disastrous consequence. The sense of being watched never fully receded now. It was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of Harris's quiet routine. He was sleeping in shifts, fully clothed, the heavy shotgun beside his bed, loaded with buckshot. The temperature dipped sharply that evening, sinking into the mid-30s, promising a freeze. The air was heavy, the surrounding forest utterly silent, anticipating the hard cold. The attack came at precisely 2 a.m. It was not announced by a howl or the clumsy crash of a beast through the underbrush. It began with an infinitely slow, methodical scratch. The sound was coming from the thin wooden paneling of the back porch. It was the noise of something hard, bone or massive claw, being dragged deliberately across the rough-sawn lumber, slow and patient, testing the resilience of the wood. It was not a violent attempt to break in, but a measured reconnaissance, the way a man might test the stability of ice before stepping onto it. Harris was instantly alert. He did not move, holding his breath, listening to the agonizingly slow drag of the talons across the damp wood. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Then came the smell. It was profound and instantaneous, seeping in through the cracks around the window frames and the floorboards. It was far more intense than the lingering odor he had found at the moose clearing. This was the fresh, immediate aroma of the creature itself. Rank, wet dog fur, mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of sulfur, overlaid with a dense, coppery, iron smell of fresh, warm blood. It was so thick, so close, that Harris felt he could taste the metallic tang on his tongue. It was a hot, terrible musk of concentrated animal power. He moved silently, rolling off the mattress and onto the cold floor, the shotgun already cradled against his shoulder. He did not turn on a light. The darkness was his only ally now. The sound of the scratching had moved, rising up the side of the house toward the window well. He knew with sickening certainty that the creature was standing directly beneath the small, frosted window, its breath condensing on the glass. Harris did not aim to eliminate the creature. He aimed only to interrupt the terrible intimacy of its inspection. He raised the shotgun, aiming deliberately low at the wall paneling below the window, where the creature's lower torso and legs were positioned as it stood upright. He fired. The roar of the shotgun in the small cabin was deafening, a physical concussive blow that momentarily blinded and stunned Harris. The wood paneling splintered violently, showering the air with dust and wet fragments. The immediate silence that followed the blast was somehow worse than the sound itself. Then, from the darkness outside, came the response, a noise that ripped the night apart. It was a sharp, high-pitched scream, undeniably laced with excruciating pain, yet quickly descending into that same choking, guttural roar Harris had heard 2 nights ago, the sound of a powerful beast trying to deny its own human anguish. The sound retreated rapidly, crashing through the brittle undergrowth, fading from a powerful roar to a desperate, wounded panting in seconds. Harris gave it a full minute of absolute silence, allowing his heartbeat to settle and the muzzle smoke to thin. He edged toward the back door, the heavy shotgun now reloaded. He threw the slide bolt and kicked the door open, his powerful battery-operated floodlight slicing through the mist. The bright beam illuminated the empty yard. Far off, the sound of movement was faint, moving quickly away toward the thick fern beds near the river. He scanned the perimeter. About 30 feet out, near the line of towering pines, he caught a final glimpse of the animal. It was already on all fours, scrambling into the dense foliage, but the light held it for a split second. The giant, black-furred torso, the long, powerful tail disappearing, but the head was the critical horror. Low and broad, not the narrow snout of a wolf. And the eyes, caught in the beam of the flashlight, were wide-set, reflecting the light back with a terrifying, almost calculating intensity. The creature halted, just before disappearing entirely. It whipped its massive head around and flicked something heavy toward the porch. Then, with a final surge of power, it vanished into the shadows, the silence rushing back in to fill the void. Harris lowered the shotgun slightly, waiting for any sign of a return. Only the sound of the rain, starting again, replaced the noise of the chase. He moved carefully to the edge of the porch, the beam of his light sweeping the ground. He found what the creature had thrown. Lying in the damp mud, directly in the path of his light, was a small, military-style backpack, heavily stained with dark, congealed blood. It was ripped, the tactical nylon shredded as if by massive claws. Beside it, attached to a tarnished metal chain, was an identification tag. Harris picked up the heavy, cold metal. It was a standard-issue Ranger's ID tag, the kind used by highly specialized search and rescue or paramilitary forest teams. He wiped the gore from the surface. Engraved clearly, Matthew P. Hayes, Ranger, 323rd Infantry. Harris knew that name vaguely from the sparse news reports 3 years earlier. Matthew Hayes had been part of a small, highly trained team that had disappeared during a high-altitude winter exercise in the Seven Summits region, nearly 30 miles away. The official ruling was hypothermia and accidental burial in an avalanche. This was not just a physical attack. This was a message, delivered with cold, terrible deliberation. The creature had suffered injury from Harris's buckshot, but it had paused, turned, and left a trophy. It did not eliminate Harris because it was playing a game. It was showing him that it possessed the spoils of human war, the weapons, the equipment, and the identities of those who had come hunting it. Harris was not the quarry tonight. He was the intended recipient of a communication, terrifying in its implications. The creature was not just surviving. It was adapting and deploying psychological warfare, using its trophies to confirm the reality of its existence. The smell of burnt coffee and cheap, greasy bacon hung heavy in the air of the only cafe located on the county line, a sad, low-slung building called Trevor's. Harris sat nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee, watching the headlights blur through the perpetual drizzle. He felt bruised, both physically and psychologically, the memory of the creature's sharp, calculating eyes still vivid. He was meeting Mary Collins, a ranger from the adjoining county who managed the deeper, less trafficked regions of the state forest. Harris knew her by reputation, tough, taciturn, with the kind of sun and rain-beaten face that looked carved out of local granite. She was known for her skepticism regarding bureaucratic nonsense, and she carried a quiet authority that transcended her rank. Mary arrived exactly on time, slipping into the booth opposite him. She did not offer a greeting, merely slid a sugar packet back and forth across the Formica tabletop. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than he remembered. 2019, I heard about the moose. 2019, she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper that cut through the faint clatter of the morning cook. 2019, and about the tracks. Tate called me, asking about large wolves. 2019. Harris nodded. 2019. It was not a wolf, and it was not an accident. 2019. He recounted the surgical kills, the bipedal tracks, the carbon fiber arrow, and finally, the midnight visit and the Ranger Hayes's dog tag. He spoke in clipped, dry phrases, presenting the facts like evidence in a courtroom, deliberately avoiding hyperbole. Mary finally stopped moving the sugar packet. She looked him directly in the eye, and there was no skepticism, no disbelief, only a profound, weary acknowledgement. 2019. We knew it was here. 2019, she confirmed, pushing her glass of water toward him, a small, concessionary gesture. 2019. Not just one. There are several. We referred to the largest one, the one that's been doing the heavy lifting, as the Alpha, unofficially. 2019. She told him about the 2019 Special Observation Teams, 2019, that had been inserted into the park over the last 4 years, operating under the guise of ecological surveys or extreme hikers. These were not Forest Service personnel. They were uniformed men, heavily armed, highly specialized. They were tasked with locating, observing, and ultimately eliminating the threat, and they kept disappearing. 2019. Matthew Hayes was one of them. 2019, she said. 2019. The team he was with went silent 3 years ago. We found their primary staging area. Everything was packed up, neat, too neat. No sign of a struggle, nothing you'd expect from a grisly attack. 2019. She paused, taking a slow, steady breath. 2019, except for the blood smears. High up on the rocks. Too high for a bear to have left it while dragging prey. The blood was there. And it was black, like old oil. 2019. Mary leaned in, her voice dropping lower, forcing Harris to strain to hear her over the whine of the deep fryer. 2019. 2 months after Hayes vanished, I found a partial body. Not a whole lot left. But I saw the hunter who was supposed to be hunting them. 2019. Her composure, typically bulletproof, wavered for a fraction of a second. She described the encounter with a severe, almost clinical detachment. 2019, he was huge. Easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Completely naked, covered in dark, matted hair that looked like it was growing right out of his skin. But the way he stood, the silhouette, it was upright. And the head, Ray, it was flat, not pointed. The eyes were too far forward. It was the same thing you tried to warn them about 5 years ago, the thing that cost you your badge. It was not a man, and it was not a beast. It was something that knew how to think like both. 2019. This was the core of the terror. Not Mary's fear, but her lack of hysterics. Her terror was old, baked into her experience, accepted as a fact of her professional life. This severe, documented seriousness convinced Harris more profoundly than any panicked civilian could have. 2019, they hunt the hunters. Ray, 2019, she stated, looking him dead in the eyes. 2019. The reports show a pattern. They avoid ordinary hikers, tourists, and families. They only target the armed and the professional. They recognize the threat, and they use tactics they have learned from watching us. 2019. She reached into her battered canvas bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photocopy. 2019. Took this from my former partner's private safe. He was on the periphery of the observation unit before he was transferred out. 2019. It was a rough map, covering the vast, inhospitable terrain they were discussing. Scattered across the surface were small, penciled-in markers denoting known elimination sites. But more disturbing were 3 larger circled areas, labeled with a thick red marker: North Ridge, Whitcomb River, and near the center, a location marked simply L2. In the corner, written so faintly it was almost missed, was a note in block letters. They know the grid. Harris felt the solid ground beneath his feet turn to quicksand. His rationalist training screamed for simple biology, for the known parameters of the natural world. But here was a professional, highly respected ranger, confirming a military operation against organized bipedal predators who understood strategy. He looked down at the map, tracing the lines that converged on L2. The cold, logical part of his mind was giving way to an ancient, deeply buried panic. The world was bigger and much, much darker than the textbooks allowed. They were dealing with something that was fundamentally wrong, something that knew how to counterattack. Mary had secured an old mud-caked Forest Service sport utility vehicle, heavy-duty and anonymous, perfect for traversing the deeply rutted fire roads. 2 days after their meeting, Harris and Mary drove miles deeper into the territory, following the faded, hand-drawn lines on the map toward the area marked on the grid as the final known location of Hayes's team. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. choked by the dense canopy overhead. The location was an old, defunct tourist lodge, long abandoned since the highway rerouting 20 years prior. The structure was a ruin, rough-hewn timber walls consumed by vibrant green moss, the roof sagging inward, exposing the interior to the constant damp. A silence hung over the place, heavy and expectant. They approached slowly, shotguns carried loosely, scanning the perimeter. The predominant smell was one of deep, cold mold and stagnant water, but Harris, pushing open the heavy, waterlogged front door, immediately caught a fainter, lingering scent beneath the decay. Old sulfur and dried blood. The main hall had been the scene of a sudden, chaotic violence. A massive pine table lay overturned, its legs snapped cleanly away from the slab top. Harris ran his flashlight beam over the walls, several long, deep furrows, running vertically from floor level almost to the collapsed ceiling, indicated the path of enormous claws, scraping wood and plaster in a rapid upward motion. The fight had been fast, fierce, and conclusive. They did not stand a chance, Mary murmured, her eyes wide as she registered the scope of the damage. They found evidence of the victim's desperate defense. Embedded deep in a ceiling beam were 3 slugs, tightly grouped, likely rifle rounds, fired upward in panic. But the weapon itself was nowhere in sight. On a filthy, ruined mattress in the corner, Harris found the most disturbing evidence. A huge stain of dried, nearly black blood, the volume suggesting massive, fatal trauma, and lying nearby, a shredded fragment of tactical body armor. The vest was made of heavy-duty synthetic fiber, designed to stop high-velocity rounds. It was not punctured. It was meticulously, violently torn. Harris picked up the fragment, the stiff material feeling shockingly light. He ran his thumb over the ripped edge. It was pulled apart, fiber by fiber, demanding extraordinary focused kinetic energy, a tearing force that surpassed any natural predator's bite or claw. It had to be delivered with a powerful, snapping yank. Rifle fire did not stop them, but they got in close, Harris concluded, his voice low. Too close. Mary led him to a small, enclosed storage room near the back, which had clearly served as the team's makeshift armory. The floor was littered with spent shell casings, dozens of them, from high-powered hunting rifles, the brass shiny and reflecting the beam of the flashlight. The team had expended a significant amount of ammunition, yet, lying on a shelf above the casings, were the expensive, high-precision rifles themselves untouched. They did not steal the weapons, Harris observed, the realization chilling him to the core. They just stopped caring about them. They eliminated the threat, but they left the tools, as if the tools had become useless against them. The attack was not about resource management. It was about tactical dominance. In the damp, musty basement, where the air was thick with the smell of peat and stored vegetables long spoiled, Mary found a discovery that shifted their understanding of the whole conflict. Tucked into a rusty metal locker behind a box of desiccated winter rations was a laminated fragment of a map. It was a partial copy of the same grid Mary had shown Harris, but significantly more detailed. This was a tactical map, focused intensely on the movement of the local terrain. But the critical detail was the color coding, drawn in what looked like charcoal or ground earth, were faint, winding lines connecting the 3 red zones, North Ridge, Whitcomb River, and L2. "These are not human roots," Mary whispered, her finger tracing a particularly difficult, steep path. No human patrol would take this path. It's too fast, too inefficient for heavy gear. Harris studied the flow of the lines. They were optimized for speed and concealment across impossible terrain. 2019. These are the migration routes of the pack. 2019, he said. 2019. This shows organized movement. They were not just reacting to the hunters. They were using established routes to flank and intercept them. 2019, Hayes's team had not been hunting a few rogue beasts. They had stumbled into the territory of an organized territorial group of creatures that used coordinated tactical movement. The implications were profound. The lycanthropes were not just genetically altered predators. They were self-aware strategists who had observed human military maneuvers and incorporated them into their own defense structure. They possessed a terrifying combination of animal instinct and human intellect. They understood the concept of a grid, a patrol route, and a choke point. They left the abandoned lodge, the atmosphere heavy with the understanding that they were dealing with a conscious, adaptive enemy. Harris felt a cold sense of respect, instantly overridden by a sharper, more immediate dread. The creature that had stood on his porch understood the rules of engagement because it had learned them from the very men who had come to eliminate it. And now, with Harris and Mary disturbing the tactical silence of the forest, the pack knew that the hunt was on again. The terror lay not in the monster's strength, but in its mind. L2 stood starkly against the gray sky, a solitary sentinel of corroded metal high atop the highest, steepest hill in the immediate area. It was an abandoned forest fire lookout tower dating back to the 1980s, its lower sections covered in a thick, insulating layer of emerald moss. From this height, Hayes's team would have had an unobstructed 360-degree view of the entire national park territory, a perfect vantage point for observation and a terrible one for defense. The ascent was brutal. The rusted metal steps were treacherous, slick with a fine coating of icy moisture and bird droppings. Each footfall on the graded steps echoed loudly in the stillness, broadcasting their presence across the silent miles. The cold air, standing around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cut like a knife. Inside the small, glass-encased observation deck, the air was still and stale, smelling of decades of dust, spiderwebs, and the faint, persistent scent of old copper. Mary stayed below, scanning the thick perimeter of pine and spruce trees with her binoculars, a silent guardian. Harris, gripping the railing, his breath steaming in the confined space, began his search. In a heavy tin supply box tucked beneath the main console, he found what he was looking for: the discarded remnants of the last watch. Empty ration packs, 3 broken radios, and a standard-issue Forest Service observation journal. The journal was damp, the spine broken, the edges of the pages softened by mold and age, but the ink was surprisingly intact. It was the log of Ranger Matthew Hayes, the man whose tag lay heavy and cold in Harris's pocket. The initial entries were routine, almost boring. Weather reports, coordinates of observed elk herds, notations on wind speed. But as Harris flipped through the pages, the tone shifted abruptly, mirroring the disintegration of the mission itself. The handwriting became hurried, the lines cramped and jagged. Hayes was reporting paranoia, not nature. He wrote about the silence. 2019, they stopped howling a week ago. Now they just watch. 2019. He detailed the terrifying nightly visits. 2019. They don't come up the ridge. They stand at the perimeter of the kill zone, 200 yards out. I count them by the reflected light in their eyes. They aren't attacking. They are just assessing. 2019, Hayes wrote about their movements. 2019. They hold weapons. I saw one of them carry a modified hunting rifle tonight. He held it correctly, Ray. Like he'd been trained. But he never fired. 2019. The escalating terror was palpable in the script. Hayes had realized that they were facing an enemy that had adapted faster than they could hunt. He described the fate of his colleague who had been injured in an earlier patrol. 2019, bitten badly on the arm. We evacuated him, but he escaped from the hospital. Said he couldn't stand the daylight anymore. 2019. Then, a month later, 2019 saw him tonight, or what used to be him, near the Whitcomb River. He was taller, impossible bulk. The human part is gone, but the tactics remain. He moved faster than anything I've ever tracked. The fur was thick, dark, growing right through his old fatigues. 2019. This was the answer to the mystery. The creature was not an ancient evil, but a rapidly evolving consequence. It was not mere infection. It was a physical, aggressive metamorphosis driven by some unknown contaminant. The entry before the last one was the chilling moment of true realization. Hayes, trapped in the cold metal cage of the lookout, finally understood the nature of their failure. His handwriting was large, almost frantic, filling the entire page. We thought we were purging the system. We thought they were just a consequence of the wild. He then described finding a fragmented, burned document, detailing a chemical experiment gone wrong. A toxin dispersed decades earlier to control the local apex predator population. A toxin that had not eliminated the species but accelerated its evolution. They are not the wilderness striking back. They are a weapon we deployed that turned on us. On the final, violently torn page of the journal, the last words scrawled in thick, trembling ink were the culmination of his horror. They hunt us because we hunted them first. We created the phantom. Harris closed the journal gently. The truth, cold and hard as the metal tower around him, settled in his consciousness. It was not a legend of the dark woods. It was a chain of cause and effect originating from a dusty government file. The lycanthropes were not supernatural monsters. They were biological horrors, the grotesque living mutation born of human arrogance and chemical warfare experiments. He smelled the old metal of the tower and the sweet decaying paper of the journal. The ranger's dog tag, the shredded backpack, the methodical kills, the organized routes. It all made a terrifying kind of sense. The forest was no longer ruled by simple hunger, but by a wounded, calculating intelligence bent on protection and grim, measured revenge. Harris descended the tower, the truth now a heavy burden. He did not just have proof of the creature. He had the full, sordid story of its genesis. He had found the phantom, and it had been created in a lab by men in uniform. The next morning, Harris was drawn back to the expansive clearing near the Whitcomb River, the location where the high schoolers had vanished 5 years ago, and which was also marked as a major transit point on the PAC's map. The sun, a rare appearance, broke through the clouds, casting harsh, contrasting shadows across the meadow. The light felt wrong, too bright for the seriousness of the business at hand. He positioned himself near the ancient stone marker that memorialized the missing teenagers, a spot that was clearly significant, a point of contact or perhaps a warning marker for the pack. He carried his heavy bolt-action rifle openly, powerful and reliable, but he did not conceal himself. He knew concealment was futile. The Alpha, or whatever sentinel watched this place, already knew he was here. He felt the presence before he saw it. A distinct physical sensation of being intensely studied. The skin on the back of his neck prickled, a cold, unmistakable certainty of focused hostility. This was not the generalized awareness of the woods. This was the narrow, focused pressure of a weapon leveled at him. Harris slowly scanned the tree line. There, exactly 200 yards distant, at the hard edge where the shadows of the spruce and fir trees began their work, stood the creature, the Alpha. It was immense, perfectly silhouetted against the dark green backdrop. Its fur was black, merging completely with the shadows, yet its verticality made it stand out, a sheer heavy column of muscle. It was not attempting to hide. It stood with an air of cold, arrogant possession, one massive arm leaning slightly on the trunk of a fallen cedar, and in its hands it held a rifle. It was an unmistakable, long-barreled hunting rifle, glinting faintly where the rare sunlight caught the polished wood of the stock. It looked like one of the precision instruments used by Hayes's missing team. The creature held it with a strange, practiced familiarity, the butt nestled naturally against its powerful shoulder. The terrifying realization struck Harris like a physical blow. It was aiming. The long barrel was steady, pointed directly at his chest. Harris slowly raised his own rifle, leveling the sight without looking through the scope. He knew the creature was not going to miss a movement. 200 yards, an easy shot for the Alpha who had inherited the skills and the knowledge of the men who trained with the weapon. A deep silence fell over the meadow, a suffocating vacuum of noise. The only sound Harris could hear was the rush of blood in his own ears. It was an impossible silent dialogue unfolding between two hunters, separated by a green field and an abyss of genetic mutation. Harris, the human, waited to be eliminated by the creature, the mutation, who was using a human weapon. But the creature did not fire. It held the sight on him for what felt like an eternity, the silence punctuated only by a faint, wet breeze. Harris felt no fear, only a raw, clarifying focus. He understood then that this was not a matter of instinct. This was a calculated moment of recognition. The Alpha knew Harris had not come armed for a massacre. He had come armed for truth. The creature slowly, deliberately lowered the rifle. The movement was smooth, purposeful, displaying full control over the mechanism. It looked at Harris. Harris could not see its eyes clearly at this distance, but he felt the weight of its stare. Then, the head dipped. A small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of chillingly human intelligence, laced with an intellectual contempt that only a superior mind could muster. I see you. I know why you are here. This was not an aggressive threat. It was a challenge, delivered with cold, terrible poise. The game was not over. Harris had not been eliminated because he had proven himself to be an investigator, not merely a hunter. He was being allowed to live so that he could pursue the truth that the creature already possessed. The Alpha shifted its weight, turning its colossal form away from the meadow. It walked toward the trees, not scampering or running, but but moving with the heavy, measured dignity of a king leaving his domain. As it stepped into the concealing shadows of the canopy, it turned its head back one final time, confirming Harris's location, reinforcing the message. The sound of its passage quickly diminished, the forest floor swallowing the heavy footfalls. Harris remained frozen for several minutes, the rifle still halfway to his shoulder, fighting the urge to vomit or scream. The encounter had not been about survival. It had been about understanding. He had been given clearance to continue his investigation. The creature knew the origin of its own horror, and it was challenging Harris to discover it, forcing him to understand the consequences of human experimentation. The most frightening aspect was the creature's intelligence. It was using the rules of engagement Harris understood, demanding that he play the game on its terms, mind over muscle. He lowered the rifle. The metal felt hot against his cheek. He had to delve into the past, into the deepest, dustiest archives of state secrets. He needed to find the source of the chemical contamination that had created this terrifying, thinking hybrid. The next week Harris spent in a state that felt like perpetual twilight, moving between the intense cold of the field and the stifling heat of the county archives building. He was chasing anomalies, but anomalies with paper trails. The archive office was in the state capitol, a dreary, climate-controlled bunker that smelled overwhelmingly of ozone, bleach, and decades of decaying paper. He had to navigate layers of bureaucracy, using the residual pull of his former investigator status and leaning heavily on Mary Collins's discreet connections to access documents dating back to the mid-1970s. He focused his search on state-sponsored wildlife control programs concerning predator populations in the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, areas covering the 3 red zones on the map. He waded through endless sheaves of reports concerning logging quotas and ecological surveys until he found what he was looking for. A series of heavily redacted reports filed under Experimental Wildlife Management, Region 9. The year was 1978. The objective was clear: a rapid, massive culling of the local gray wolf population, which was impacting the deer and elk herds, and therefore the hunting revenue. The method was horrifyingly simple: toxic bait. Harris found detailed descriptions of the compound used, an experimental fast-acting neurotoxin based on a military-grade preparation known as hydroxylamine derivative, developed for rapid incapacitation and elimination. It was mixed with carcass material and strategically dropped by helicopter across remote, deep forest zones. The initial reports were celebratory: a massive, successful purge. 90% of the targeted population was eliminated within weeks. But on page 78 of the final summary report, tucked away in a footnote labeled a typical subject response, was the chilling detail that confirmed Hayes' frantic scrawl. The report noted that 2019, approximately 10% of observed individuals exhibited a profound resistance to the compound, followed by rapid, aggressive cellular restructuring, 2019. The text, heavy with technical jargon, went on to describe observable effects in the resistant animals: severe neurological distress, visual and auditory hallucinations, aggressive behavior amplified far beyond normal instinct, and a rapid increase in bone density and muscle mass. The neurotoxin had not destroyed the survivors. It had accelerated their physiology, triggered a catastrophic, forced evolution. The compound, designed to collapse the nervous system, had instead acted as a catalyst, restructuring their base deoxyribonucleic acid. Harris imagined the reality. A wolf, poisoned, racked with searing pain, its body fighting the chemical attack. Instead of dying, its system adapted, generating hyperdense musculature and calcified bone structure, forcing its body into a more efficient bipedal form. The aggression and hallucination had cemented its mental state into one of permanent, directed rage. They were not supernatural creatures, they were biological artifacts, a horrifying, living side effect of a botched government operation. They were lycanthropes in the modern sense, hybrids of the natural world and weaponized chemistry. They possessed the strength and resilience of the wolf, coupled with the tactical memory and residual intelligence of the men they had subsequently eliminated. He worked backward, connecting the archival reports to the present-day events. The creature he called the Alpha was a direct descendant of those initial 10% survivors, or even one of the originals, preserved by its monstrous, mutated lifespan. The pieces slammed into place, creating a coherent, devastating picture. The creature's motive was not random savagery. It was not hunger. It was balance, taught through elimination. The lycanthropes were specifically targeting those who entered their domain with the intention of causing violence. Poachers, military-style hunters, anyone who posed a threat to their nascent, adapted species. They were self-appointed guardians, using the methods they had learned from observing the very human violence that had created them. Harris pushed back from the dusty table, the ancient smell of the paper filling his lungs. The truth was far more unsettling than any myth. This was not a demon rising from the ancient shadows. This was a monster engineered by the military-industrial complex, an unwanted product of sloppy, reckless science, now wielding a hunting rifle and exhibiting organized, retaliatory intelligence. He had exposed the source of the horror. And with that knowledge came a terrible clarity about the inevitability of the coming conflict. He was no longer just an investigator. He was now a man standing on the threshold between two warring species, both products of the same poisonous lineage. Harris spent a day preparing. The discovery in the archives had removed the last vestiges of fear and replaced it with grim determination. He was not facing a demon. He was facing a biological defense mechanism, a self-aware anomaly that had adapted human tactics. He chose to escalate the situation, knowing that the only way to end the surveillance and the violence was to meet the Alpha on its own turf, using its rules of confrontation. He drove his old truck to the deepest point on the Whitcomb River, where the gorge narrowed and the cold, gray water roared over slick black stones. This was one of the pack's primary transit points, a place where the air was always thick with the smell of wet moss and fast-moving water. Harris put on his heavy Kevlar vest, adjusted his rifle sling, and secured the high-powered ammunition, rounds specially designed for maximum penetration. He walked out onto a wide shingle beach where the fog from the river water hung low and heavy, obscuring the banks like a veil. He did not hide. He stood in the middle of the exposed beach, waiting for the familiar pressure of being watched. The cold air amplified sound. The only noise was the water, then faintly the sharp snap of a heavy branch breaking far upstream. It was here. He took a deep breath, the damp air stinging his lungs, and spoke into the silence, his voice flat but loud, cutting through the river's drone. Matthew Hayes sent me a message. I know what you are. I know what they did to you." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with lethal potential. Then, the world erupted. The Alpha burst from the dense pine thicket, not 200 yards away this time, but 50. It moved with a terrifying blend of raw, animalistic velocity and focused, linear speed. It was a black blur, closing the distance instantly, its massive shadow warping in the thick fog. Harris reacted on pure instinct, raising the rifle and firing 3 quick shots. The heavy retort cracked the air. The first 2 rounds hit the creature squarely in the chest. There was a sickening, hollow thud, but the massive momentum was only briefly arrested. The creature staggered, a grunt escaping its throat, but it did not fall. It wore a dense, thick coat of fur and muscle that acted as natural armor. The Alpha hit Harris like a freight train. Harris was slammed backward, the air knocked violently from his lungs as he tumbled into the rocky riverbed. The creature was a blur of teeth and slashing claws, aiming for the neck. Harris brought the rifle up, swinging the heavy stock in a wide arc, connecting with the Alpha's flat, broad head. The blow was solid, momentarily stunning the creature and buying Harris a desperate second. He scrambled back, adrenaline overriding the searing pain in his chest. He saw the creature pause, its eyes, those focused, intelligent, almost human eyes, filled with a shocking mixture of searing physical agony and incandescent rage. The beast was hurt, but not eliminated. As Harris struggled to reload, jamming fresh rounds into the breech, he saw the moment of distraction. The Alpha had not come forward to press the attack. Instead, it moved sideways, positioning its colossal body between Harris and a low, dense clump of marsh ferns near the water's edge. From the ferns, Harris heard a faint sound, a small, thin, utterly vulnerable sound, a whimpering, high-pitched cry, like a puppy in distress. Harris hesitated, momentarily stunned. He looked past the Alpha's massive protective frame. In the shadows of the fern, barely visible, he saw a small, huddled shape. It was a juvenile covered in sparse, dark brown fur, its eyes disproportionately large and black, gazing out with the same chilling intelligence as the adult. A pup. The Alpha was not just a hunter, it was a parent, protecting its young. The distraction proved fatal to Harris's defense. The creature, realizing Harris had seen the pup, unleashed a blindingly fast, powerful strike with its clawed forelimb. It was a blow designed not to kill, but to incapacitate. The force of the strike hit Harris's chest plate like a sledgehammer. The Kevlar held, but the kinetic energy transferred violently. Harris felt a sickening, agonizing crack, 2 ribs snapping under the pressure, and a blinding burst of pain. His lungs seized up, and he collapsed onto the muddy rocks, gasping for breath that would not come. He lay there, utterly defeated, looking up at the towering shadow of the Alpha. The creature stood over him, its breath coming in wet, ragged gasps, its eyes burning with the raw hatred of a parent defending its bloodline. It did not land the killing blow. Instead, the Alpha simply stood there, watching Harris struggle for air. It reached down, scooped the tiny pup up in one massive, surprisingly gentle arm, and then, with a final, chilling glance of judgment, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the riverbank. The immediate danger was over. Harris lay in the cold mud, his body shaking from shock. When he finally managed to sit up, he saw the final, eloquent gesture of the confrontation. Lying near his outstretched hand, half submerged in the running water, was the hunting rifle, Matthew Hayes's weapon. The Alpha had left it behind. The message was clear. Harris had been tested. He had passed. He was not an indiscriminate hunter. The Alpha had spared him, ending the duel when Harris proved he was interested in understanding, not annihilation. Harris woke to the stark, unforgiving brightness of a hospital room ceiling. The smell of antiseptic and cheap institutional coffee had replaced the scent of pine and moss. 2 of his ribs were cracked, taped tightly to stabilize them, and his face was a tapestry of bruises. He was lucky to have survived the encounter. He spent the next 2 days dictating his report, not to the sheriff, who had already summarily dismissed his injuries as a 2019 stupid fall near the river 2019. But to a small voice recorder he kept tucked beneath his pillow. This was not a police document. It was a comprehensive literary article. He detailed the history, the 1978 toxin, the forced mutation of the surviving wolf population, the resulting biological entity, a thinking, adaptable hybrid. He recounted the pattern of the killings, the military tactics, the trophies, and the chilling realization of the Alpha's parentage. He titled it, The Lycanthrope Legend. Not myth, but the result of human hunting taken to its logical, horrific extreme. He typed the final draft on his laptop, emailing it, along with the photographic evidence from his field cameras and scanned pages from Ranger Hayes's journal, to a national publication known for its long-form investigative pieces. He felt a profound obligation to release the truth. The world needed to understand what was walking in the Washington forests and how they, humanity, had caused it. The response arrived within 24 hours. A polite, lengthy, but firm refusal. The editor's email was cordial. While the prose is extraordinary, Mr. Harris, the claims are wildly contradictory to established science and ecological understanding. The narrative of chemical-induced bipedal wolf mutations, coupled with evidence of military-grade tactics, pushes the boundary far beyond credible investigative journalism. It too closely resembles genre fiction. We simply cannot publish something this irrational, as it would destroy our reputation. The establishment, Harris realized with a bitter taste, was not interested in a truth that dismantled its own orderly universe. They preferred the comforting lie of natural predators or crazy poachers to the terrifying reality of human error spiraling into monstrous consequence. Mary Collins came to visit him late that evening. She sat in the vinyl chair, her face grave. He handed her the printed stack of his unpublished manuscript. She read the document quickly, her lips moving silently over the details of the D-97 arrows and the hydroxylamine footnotes. When she finished, she placed the stack on his bedside tray. "It's all here, isn't it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Every damn detail." She looked at him with profound sorrow. "Burn it, Ray. You know you cannot publish this truth. If you did, what then? The government would immediately deny everything. Then every nut with a high-powered rifle and a conspiracy theory would descend on this forest, convinced they're fighting the monster of the week." She rested her hand briefly on his immobilized chest. "They will hunt them with heavy combat vehicles and bombers. They will kill everything that moves, hoping to eliminate the threat. The Alpha and its pack, they will stop differentiating. They will start killing everyone, tourists, kids, the innocent, because the forest will be filled with armed threats. The war will escalate, and thousands will perish." Harris felt the crushing physical weight of this knowledge. He had the power to expose the truth, but the publication would only lead to a devastating, inevitable bloodbath. He knew Mary was right. The creature was terrible, but it was currently exercising restraint, targeting only the violent. Unleash humanity's panic, and that restraint would vanish. "We created the phantom," he murmured, quoting Hayes' final, desperate scrawl. "And now we have to live with it," Mary finished. Harris decided then. The truth, dangerous and cold, would have to remain his alone. He was the only man alive who understood the creature's motivations and the history of its pain. He had a responsibility that superseded journalistic integrity or personal vindication. When he returned to the cabin, bruised but moving, he collected every shred of evidence. The unpublished manuscript, the camera photos of the towering shadow, the carbon fiber arrow, and Matthew Hayes' moldering diary. He bundled them together, wrapped them in heavy tar paper, and secured them inside the massive fireproof safe hidden beneath the loose floorboards in his bedroom closet. The heavy steel door closed with a dull, conclusive thud. He was no longer seeking justice or notoriety. He had become something else entirely. He was a keeper of the line, the silent guard standing between the mistake of the past and the explosive violence of the future. He was the one man who understood the nature of the horror and chose to lock it away, sacrificing his own peace of mind for the fragile, deceptive stability of the world outside the forest. A year passed, marked by the predictable, slow rotation of the Pacific Northwest climate, the deep, soggy gloom of winter giving way to the brief, misleading intensity of a rainy summer, before sinking back into the endless, misty damp of autumn. Life around the area settled back into its comfortable rhythm of isolation. Harris's ribs healed, leaving him with a faint chronic ache when the barometric pressure dropped. His gaze, however, remained permanently hardened, and his senses were tuned to the slightest shift in the forest's acoustic profile. He had become the town's most competent, if unofficial, repairman, mending boats, fixing leaky roofs, keeping his hands busy, but his mind always alert. He was the steward of the secret, waiting for the inevitable sign of the creature's reappearance. It came with the first hard frost of the late autumn. Two local men, both known for their cruel tendencies and their frequent incursions into the park under the guise of illegal trapping and shooting, were found deep in the northern hills. Their demise was reported with Tate's usual flat incompetence. Bear attack. Harris drove out the next morning, leaving the sheriff to his paperwork. He knew the two men, their names not worth remembering, only their reputations for brutality. They had been eliminated with the familiar chilling efficiency. The throats were torn, the wounds clean and surgical. The kill was precise and absolute. Tate's men, walking the perimeter, had seen only vague scuff marks. But Harris, moving silently through the thick layer of wet, copper-colored maple leaves, saw the tracks leading away from the carnage. They were lighter this time, less weighty than the Alpha's 15-inch stride, but unmistakably bipedal. The heel strike was less pronounced, the stride shorter, 30 inches. But the 5 digits and the deep, inch-long claw grooves were identical. It was the work of a younger creature, the pup he had seen, now grown and hunting alongside its parent, or another, smaller member of the pack. The cycle of the inverse hunt was continuing. The creatures were still fulfilling their self-appointed role as the forest's ruthless, mutated defense system. They were still targeting the violent, maintaining the balance. The crucial evidence, the one meant specifically for him, came in a small metallic flash hidden near the belt line of one of the destroyed men. Harris found it snagged on the thick leather of a cartridge belt, partially buried in the mud. He cleaned the object on his jacket sleeve, his heart hammering a heavy, dull rhythm against his healed ribs. It was a lead bullet, heavy and deformed, its copper jacket peeled back like a flower. He recognized the specific tooling, the serrated grooves designed for maximum expansion. It was one of his rounds, a high-powered hunting bullet he had fired into the Alpha's chest during their brutal confrontation at the river a year ago. The round had penetrated the thick muscle but had not passed through the creature's dense, resilient body. It had been carried inside the Alpha for a year, a painful, constant reminder of the encounter. And now the pack had deposited it here, a physical, undeniable communication. We remember the rules. We remember you. It was a continuation of the dialogue, cold, intellectual, and deeply unsettling. The pack had returned to hunting, but they were using the relics of their human conflict to leave a calling card. They were not merely surviving. They were evolving into a communicative, organized force, using fear and evidence as weapons. Harris stood by the dark, rushing water, the scent of fresh pine and cold iron filling his lungs. Dusk was falling rapidly, the mist creeping in from the river, swallowing the edges of the forest. He could feel the familiar weight of the responsibility he had locked in the safe. He walked back to his truck, pulled out the heavy shotgun, and charged it with high-powered slugs. The metal was heavy and cold in his hands, familiar, like an extension of his own will. He was not afraid anymore. Fear had been replaced by a quiet, profound acceptance of his fate. He knew what came next. The hunt was not over. It was merely redefined. He walked to the riverbank, the fog swirling around his knees. He raised the heavy shotgun, resting it easily against his shoulder, facing the dark, impenetrable boundary of the forest. From the deepest part of the thicket, beyond the veil of the river fog, came the sound. It was the same low, tearing howl, too guttural for a wolf, too intelligent for a beast, a sound laced with the suffering and the intellect of its human origin. It was the cry of the creature that was created, announcing its return to the territories. Harris did not flinch. He aimed the heavy barrel at the precise, unseen location of the sound. He stood his ground, the final solitary guard on the line he was meant to protect. He opened his mouth, and though no one but the forest could hear him, he accepted the challenge, quietly speaking his final realization into the encroaching darkness. Now I know exactly what we created, and I know they hunt by the same rules we taught them. He waited, the finger resting on the cold steel of the trigger, ready for the next move in a game that would never end.